My name is Indy, and I need to tell you something that's been eating at me for 3 months now. I'm a real estate agent working the Oregon coast. Moved up here from Sacramento about 5 years ago after getting my marine biology degree and realizing I couldn't stomach the corporate lab work. Selling beach houses seemed like a decent compromise. Still got to be near the ocean, made better money, and I thought I'd left the weird science behind me. I was wrong about that last part. It started in late August when I got a listing for a property in Bandon. Beautiful place, right on the cliff overlooking the beach. One of those classic Oregon coast homes with huge windows and weathered cedar siding. The kind of place that should sell itself. 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, completely renovated kitchen. The price was almost suspicious, way below market value for that location. The seller was some property management company out of Portland, handling it for an estate. They told me the previous owner had passed away. No family, just get it sold quick. Easy commission, I thought. I drove down on a Tuesday to do the initial walkthrough and take photos. It was one of those perfect coastal days where the marine layer had burned off early and everything looked like a postcard. I let myself in with the lockbox code, did my usual routine, checking outlets, faucets, looking for any issues I'd need to disclose. Everything was pristine. Too pristine, actually. The place felt staged, but also somehow lived in, like someone had just stepped out for groceries and would be back any minute. There was even a coffee mug in the sink, which seemed odd for an estate sale property. After I finished inside, I walked down the wooden staircase that led from the back deck to the beach. It was a gorgeous private access, the kind of feature that would be the main selling point. The stairs were sturdy, well maintained. At the bottom, there was a small stretch of sand, and then the tide pool started. These incredible rock formations that Bandon's famous for. I'd been a marine biologist, so tide pools were my thing. I couldn't resist checking them out. That's when I saw them. Handprints. Small handprints, like from children, maybe 7 or 8 years old. 3 distinct sets of them, pressed into the rock inside one of the deeper pools. My first thought was that they were fossils, but that didn't make sense. The rock formation was wrong, and fossils don't look that fresh. These looked like someone had pressed their hands into wet concrete, except it was solid stone. I took some photos, mostly just because it was unusual. Pretty even. I thought it might make a good detail for the listing. Charming tide pool features. The first showing was that Friday. Young couple from Portland, tech money, looking for a weekend place. They loved everything about the house. We were standing on the deck talking about their offer plans when the wife pointed down at the beach and asked if those were the tide pools I'd mentioned in the listing. I said yes, and we all walked down to look. I wanted to show them the handprints because they really were kind of remarkable. Except they weren't in the same pool. I found them 3 pools over, in a spot that had been completely dry during my Tuesday visit. Same 3 sets of hands, same size, same depth. The husband was looking at me strangely because I'd gone quiet, just staring at these prints. I played it off, said something about the unique geological features, but I could feel something cold settling in my stomach. The couple made an offer that afternoon. I should have been happy. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those handprints, about how they'd moved. I told myself I was remembering wrong, that I'd just gotten confused about which pool I'd seen them in, but I'd been a scientist. I knew how to observe details. I knew what I'd seen. Sunday morning, I drove back to Bandon. I didn't tell anyone I was going. I just needed to see those pools again in daylight, needed to prove to myself that I was being ridiculous. I parked on the street instead of the driveway. I don't know why. It just felt like I shouldn't announce my presence. The walk down to the beach felt longer than I remembered. The fog was thick that morning, typical coastal weather, and it made everything feel muffled and strange. The handprints had moved again. This time they were in a pool much closer to the stairs, in a spot where the tide would have covered them completely at high tide the night before. But they looked exactly the same. Not worn, not faded. Perfect. I stood there in the cold morning fog and felt something I hadn't felt since I was a child. Pure, animal fear. The kind that makes you want to run without knowing why. I did something then that I'm not proud of. I went back to my car and I looked up the property records. Really looked at them. Not just the recent stuff, but going back decades. The house had been built in 1985 by a family named Morrison. They'd lived there for 2 years. Then the property had been sold in 1987 to someone else, then sold again in 1989, then again in 1992. It had changed hands 11 times in 38 years. That's not normal for a house that nice in that location. People hold on to coastal property. It appreciates. You don't sell unless you have to. I started making calls. I told people I was doing research for the listing, which was technically true. I talked to 3 of the previous owners. 2 of them hung up on me when I mentioned the address. The third one, an older woman named Gloria, who'd owned it in the late 90s, she actually talked to me. She asked me if I'd seen them yet. I didn't have to ask what she meant. I said yes. She told me she was sorry, that she should have said something when she sold it, but she'd been so desperate to leave that she couldn't risk the sale falling through. Then she told me about the Morrison family. They'd had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, ages 6, 8, and 9. In June of 1987, all 3 of them drowned in the tide pools behind the house. It happened during a family barbecue. The parents thought the kids were playing upstairs. When they realized they weren't, they ran down to the beach and found all 3 of them face down in the pools. The emergency responders said it didn't make sense. The water in tide pools isn't deep enough to drown in unless you're deliberately holding yourself under, and 3 children wouldn't all do that at once. There was an investigation, but no conclusion. Accidental death, the report said. The family moved away 2 months later. Gloria told me she tried to find the death certificates once, tried to look up newspaper articles about it. Nothing. No obituaries, no funeral home records, no death certificates filed with the county. It was like those children had never existed. But the handprints were there, and they moved. She'd watched them over the 2 years she'd lived there. They started far out near the water line. Over time, they got closer to the house. When she sold the property, they were right at the base of the stairs. She asked me where they were now. I told her. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "They're almost to the house. You need to stop the sale." I didn't stop the sale. I told myself Gloria was just a crazy old woman, that grief and guilt had made people construct an urban legend around a tragedy. I told myself the handprints were some kind of geological phenomenon I didn't understand, that my marine biology degree clearly had some gaps. The couple's offer was accepted. We were set to close in 3 weeks. I went back to the property one more time, 2 days before closing. I don't know what I was looking for. Closure, maybe, or proof that I was overreacting. The handprints were on the stairs now, not in the pools. On the wooden stairs leading up from the beach, pressed into the wood like the wood was soft clay. 3 sets of small hands reaching upward. I put my own hand next to one of them. My hand was bigger, adult-sized. These were children's hands, and the wood around them was dry and splintered and old, but the prints themselves looked fresh. I called the buyer that evening and told her I couldn't complete the sale. I said I'd found undisclosed structural issues, that there were problems with the foundation. She threatened to sue me. Her lawyer sent letters. My broker was furious. I lost my license for 6 months over the ethics violation. I didn't care. I couldn't sell that house to anyone. I couldn't put someone else's family in there. The property management company found another agent. The house sold 4 months later to a family from California. They have 2 children. I looked them up online. I know I shouldn't have, but I couldn't help it. A boy and a girl, ages 7 and 9. I think about calling them sometimes, about warning them. But what would I say? That there are handprints in the tide pools that move. That 3 children, who may or may not have died 38 years ago, are climbing closer to the house. That the ocean remembers things we've chosen to forget. I don't work in real estate anymore. I got a job at the abandoned aquarium giving tours, talking about tide pool ecology. I go to that beach sometimes, but never to that house. I don't want to know where the handprints are now. I don't want to know if they made it to the top of the stairs, if they're on the deck, if they're reaching for the door. Some things you can't sell, can't package up, and transfer to someone else. Some things stay. Some things keep climbing slowly, year after year, getting closer to something. I just hope the family moves before the handprints reach the inside of the house. I hope they're smarter than the rest of us. I hope they listen when the ocean tries to tell them something's wrong, but they probably won't. Nobody ever does. We see what we want to see until it's too late to look away. My name is Waylon, and I've worked at the same lumber mill my entire adult life, just like my father did, and his father before him. I'm 52 years old now, been at Sweet Home Mill for 34 years straight. Started when I was 18, right out of high school, and never left. This town is logging country, always has been. The mill was everything here. Paid for the schools, sponsored the little league teams, kept the grocery store open. When it shut down last March, it felt like someone had ripped the heart out of Sweet Home. We all knew it was coming. Timber regulations, environmental concerns, cheaper lumber from Canada. The writing had been on the wall for years, but that didn't make it easier when they finally locked the gates. For 6 months, this town died. Main Street emptied out. Families moved away. The diner cut its hours down to breakfast only. I watched men I'd known my whole life turn gray and hollow, sitting on their porches with nothing to do and no prospects. I was one of them. My wife Cameron kept us afloat with her job at the school district office, but I could see the worry in her eyes every time another bill came. I applied everywhere. Other mills, in other towns, hardware stores, anything. Nothing came through. At 52, nobody wants to train you for something new. Then in September, we heard the mill had been sold. New ownership, some investment group from Portland nobody had heard of. They were going to reopen it, modernize the operation, and they were hiring back the old crew. The news spread through town like wildfire. I got the call on a Tuesday afternoon. The voice on the phone was professional, friendly. They wanted me back at my old position, same pay grade, benefits starting immediately. There was just one condition. Everyone had to attend a mandatory safety training weekend before reopening. 2 days, Friday and Saturday, at a facility up near Detroit Lake. Transportation and lodging provided. I didn't think twice about it. I said yes before the caller even finished explaining. Cameron was happy for me, but something about it bothered her. She kept asking questions I didn't have answers to. Who exactly bought the mill? Why the sudden investment in a struggling timber town? What kind of safety training takes an entire weekend at a remote location? I told her she was overthinking it, that we needed this, that I needed this. She touched my face and said she knew, but I should be careful anyway. I kissed her forehead and promised I would be. The Friday of training, a charter bus picked up about 40 of us from the mill parking lot. Guys I'd known for decades, men I'd worked beside through injuries and layoffs and good years and bad. We were all excited, joking around like we were heading to a football game instead of a training seminar. My buddy Nolan sat next to me. Nolan and I went back to elementary school. Our kids had played together, been in the same classes. His daughter and my son had gone to prom together junior year. He was my closest friend in the world, the kind of friend where you don't have to explain anything because they already know. The facility near Detroit Lake was nicer than I expected. Modern building, conference rooms with new equipment, catered meals. The first evening was normal enough. Orientation packets, videos about new safety equipment, OSHA regulation updates. Boring but necessary. We all stayed in a bunkhouse-style lodging. Nothing fancy but clean. That night, Nolan and I stayed up late talking like we always did, reminiscing about the old days at the mill. looking forward to getting back to work. I remember he told me about his grandson learning to walk. I remember thinking how good it felt to have hope again. Saturday morning, I woke up feeling strange, foggy, like I'd slept too hard. The training that day was different. They split us into smaller groups and took us to different rooms. I don't remember much of what happened in those sessions. That's the thing that bothers me most. I can remember Friday clearly, but Saturday is just fragments. Images of screens, people talking, some kind of exercises. When it was over Saturday evening, we got back on the bus and came home. Everyone was quiet on the ride back. Not tired quiet, just quiet. The mill reopened the following Monday. I showed up at 5:30 in the morning like I always had, lunchbox packed, thermos of coffee ready to work. The parking lot was full of familiar trucks, but something felt off immediately. I couldn't put my finger on it. I walked into the break room and saw Nolan already there. I called out to him, made some joke about him trying to make the rest of us look bad by showing up early. He looked at me and smiled, but it was wrong somehow. Too polite, too distant. He said good morning and turned back to his coffee. I sat down next to him and started talking about his grandson, asked how the little guy was doing with his walking. Nolan looked confused. He said he didn't have a grandson. I laughed, thought he was messing with me. I said, come on, your daughter's kid, the one you were telling me about Friday night. He just stared at me. He said his daughter didn't have any children, that I must be thinking of someone else. Then he got up and walked away before I could respond. I tried to shake it off. Maybe I'd mixed up a story. Maybe he'd been talking about someone else's grandkid and I'd misremembered. But it nagged at me all morning. During lunch break, I brought it up again, tried to jog his memory. Nolan got irritated. He said he really didn't know what I was talking about and could I please drop it. That's when I noticed his wedding ring was gone. Nolan had been married for 28 years. I asked him where his ring was. He said he wasn't married, never had been. I went outside and called Cameron. My hands were shaking. I told her something was wrong, that Nolan was acting strange, saying things that weren't true. She asked if maybe he was having some kind of medical episode, early dementia or something. I said maybe, but it didn't feel like that. It felt like he genuinely didn't remember his own life. She told me to come home, that we could figure it out. I said I would, right after shift. But it wasn't just Nolan. Over the next week, I started noticing it with everyone. Small things at first. Men who'd been vocal about certain things suddenly quiet. Guys who used to complain about management now praising every decision. Workers who'd fought for union representation acting like they'd never cared about it. People I'd had long conversations with about their families suddenly changing details, or forgetting those conversations entirely. The worst part was how they all looked at me when I brought these things up. Like I was the problem, like I was the one who'd changed. I started keeping my mouth shut, just observing. Everyone seemed content, happy even. Nobody complained about the pay cuts that came through in October. Nobody questioned why the new management had installed cameras everywhere, even in the break rooms. Nobody seemed bothered by the new quota system that had us working harder for less money. They just smiled and did their work and went home. I stopped going to the break room. I kept my head down and tried to pretend everything was normal. But I couldn't stop watching them. These men I'd known my whole life, trying to figure out what had happened. They moved the same, talked the same, but something essential was missing. It was like looking at really good copies of the originals. All the surface details were right, but the depth was gone. Cameron noticed I was struggling. She tried to help, suggested maybe I was the one who was misremembering things, that stress could do that. Maybe I was depressed about all the changes. She set up an appointment with a doctor. I went, because I was starting to doubt myself too. Maybe I was losing it. Maybe the months of unemployment had broken something in my brain. The doctor said I was fine, physically healthy, no signs of cognitive decline. He suggested therapy for anxiety. I made an appointment I never kept. Nolan started avoiding me. We used to eat lunch together every day. Now he sat with different people he barely knew before. When I tried to join him one day, he got up and moved to another table. It was like watching a stranger wear my best friend's face. I wanted to grab him, shake him, make him remember. But what would that accomplish? Either he genuinely didn't remember and I'd look insane, or something had been done to him that I couldn't undo. 3 months ago, they announced another training weekend. Same setup, Friday and Saturday. Facility near Detroit Lake, mandatory for all employees. This time I refused. I told my supervisor I couldn't make it, invented a family emergency. He got very quiet on the phone. He said attendance wasn't optional, that it was clearly stated in my employment contract. I'd never seen anything like that in my contract, but when I went home and checked, there it was. In small print, I swear wasn't there before. I didn't go. I called in sick that Friday and stayed home. Cameron didn't ask questions anymore. She'd learned to just accept that something was wrong, even if neither of us could name it. That weekend, while everyone else was at training, I drove to the mill. The gates were locked, but I knew a way in through the back fence that had been broken for years. I wanted to see what they were really doing there, wanted to find some evidence of what had happened. The mill was empty and dark. I walked through familiar spaces that felt alien now. Everything was too clean, too organized. Mills are supposed to be chaotic, lived-in places. This looked like a stage set. I found my way to the main office, tried some doors. Most were locked, but one opened into what looked like a records room. I turned on the light and started going through files, employee records, production reports, safety documentation. Then I found something that made my blood stop. A binder labeled Phase 2 Implementation. Inside were psychological profiles. Every employee who'd attended that training, including me. Except my file was marked differently. Red stamp across the top. Non-responsive. Monitor and assess. Under that were notes about my behavior, my questions, my resistance to conditioning. The word conditioning. I photographed every page with my phone, my hand shaking so badly I had to take some shots twice. There were other files too. Medical records showing brain scans, blood work, psychological evaluations. All dated from that training weekend. I found Nolan's file. His brain scan showed activity patterns that looked wrong to me, even though I'm no doctor. There were annotations about successful integration and memory restructuring complete. The clinical language made it worse somehow. They were talking about erasing who people were, like it was just data management. I left the mill and drove home. I didn't tell Cameron what I'd found. I didn't know how to explain it without sounding insane. Instead, I just held her close and tried to memorize exactly who she was, every detail, in case one day she came home different, and I needed to remember what I'd lost. Monday morning, I went back to work. Nobody mentioned that I'd missed the training. Nobody asked where I'd been, but I could feel them watching me differently. The cameras seemed to follow me more. My supervisor started checking on me more frequently, asking how I was feeling, if everything was okay at home. The questions sounded concerned but felt like assessment. Nolan stopped acknowledging me entirely. We'd been friends for over 40 years, and now when I walked past him, he looked through me like I was invisible. Sometimes I'd catch him staring at me from across the floor, and his expression was completely blank. No recognition, no curiosity, nothing. Just empty observation. I started documenting everything. I wrote down every memory I had of the people I worked with, every detail about who they used to be. I kept it all in a notebook I hid in my truck. Cameron found it once and asked what I was doing. I told her I was just keeping a journal, trying to process everything. She looked worried but didn't push. I think part of her knew that if she pushed too hard, she might not like what she found. Last week, they announced another round of training. This one is scheduled for next month. My name is on the list. Cameron's name is on the list too. They've started hiring people from the school district office, bringing them into some kind of partnership program. She got the invitation 3 days ago. She was excited about it, said it would be good for her career, good for us financially. I watched her read the letter and felt something cold settle into my bones. I don't know what to do. If I refuse again, they'll fire me, and then what? We can't afford to lose my income, but if Cameron goes to that training and comes back different, I'll lose her anyway. Not the physical her, but everything that makes her who she is. I'll be sitting across the breakfast table from a stranger who looks like my wife and sounds like my wife, but doesn't remember our first date, or the way she cried at our wedding, or the nickname she calls me when we're alone. I park in the lot at 5:45 now, 15 minutes later than I used to. I sit in my truck and watch the men I used to know file into the building. I count how many of them I still recognize, really recognize. The number gets smaller every week. Last Monday, Nolan walked right past my truck with 2 other workers. They were laughing about something. For a second, just a second, I thought I heard his real laugh, the one I'd known since we were kids. But then it was gone, and I realized I might have just imagined it because I wanted it to be real so badly. They'll call me in for training again eventually. Maybe next month when Cameron goes. Maybe they'll insist we go together, make it sound like a couple's retreat or team building exercise. I don't know what I'll do when that happens. Part of me wants to go, wants to stop fighting, wants whatever they gave everyone else that makes them content. The forgetting looks peaceful. The acceptance looks easy. But a bigger part of me knows I'm the only one left who remembers. Someone has to remember that Nolan had a grandson, that people used to fight for better wages instead of accepting cuts with a smile, that we were different once, that we were real once. I just don't know how long I can keep remembering alone, and I don't know if I'm strong enough to watch Cameron forget me while still looking at my face every day. So tell me this, if everyone around you started forgetting who they were but seemed happier for it, would you choose to remember and suffer, or forget and find peace? My name is Georgina, and I teach history at Cape Mears Elementary School, or at least I did until last month when I stopped showing up. I'm 63 years old, been teaching for 41 years, and I've lived in this area my whole life. My parents moved here when I was 3, and I never saw a reason to leave. The coast has always felt like home to me, something in the salt air and the fog that just settles into your bones. After I retired from full-time teaching 5 years ago, I started volunteering at the Historical Society, cataloging old documents and helping with research requests. It gave me something to do, kept my mind sharp, and I genuinely loved piecing together the stories of the families who'd lived here before us. Last April, someone donated a collection of items from the old Cape Mears lighthouse keepers' quarters. The lighthouse has been automated since the 70s, and the keeper's house had been sold off to private owners decades ago, changed hands a few times. This particular donation came from an estate sale after the most recent owner passed away. Boxes of old journals, photographs, maintenance logs, weather reports, the kind of mundane historical record that most people find boring, but I find fascinating. I volunteered to sort through it all and catalog what was worth keeping for the archive. I started going through the boxes on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Most of it was exactly what I expected. Daily logs about lamp maintenance, oil consumption, notes about passing ships. The handwriting was beautiful, that careful script people used to have before computers. The keeper's name was listed in our records as Thomas Whitmore, served from 1948 until 1962. I'd actually researched him before, knew he'd been a widower who took the posting after his wife died, lived alone in the lighthouse for 14 years before retiring. Seemed like a lonely life, but the logs suggested he found it peaceful. Then I found a separate journal, smaller than the official logs, leather-bound and personal. It wasn't part of the lighthouse records, it was his private diary. I almost didn't read it because it felt intrusive, but Historical Society policy is that donated materials become public record, and someone needed to determine if it had archival value. So I started reading. The early entries were mundane. Thomas wrote about his daily routines, his grief over losing his wife, his adjustment to the isolation. He mentioned seeing whales, described storms, wrote about the few visitors who occasionally made the trek out to the lighthouse. Then I got to an entry from June 1952. He wrote about his daughter visiting. That stopped me cold because all the official records said Thomas Whitmore never had children. I went back to our files to double-check. Nothing. No mention of a daughter anywhere. The entry described her as 7 years old, dark hair like her mother, afraid of the height at first, but eventually loving to watch the ocean from the tower. He wrote about her laugh, how she'd count the rotations of the light, how she collected shells on the rocks below. Over the next several entries, she appeared regularly. He called her Georgie. He wrote about teaching her to read the weather, about her drawings of seabirds, about her questions that he couldn't always answer. He wrote like a father who adored his child. Then there was an entry from September 1952. The words were shaky, barely legible. His daughter had fallen from the rocks. The tide had come in fast. He'd found her too late. He described pulling her small body from the water, trying to revive her, failing. The grief in those pages was overwhelming, raw, and desperate. He wrote that he couldn't bear to report it, couldn't face the investigation and the questions and the blame. He buried her himself in a spot overlooking the ocean, marked it with stones, told no one. I sat there in the Historical Society office with my hands trembling, reading about this man covering up his daughter's death. It explained why there were no official records, but something about it bothered me. If she died in 1952, why were there entries about her after that date? I flipped forward. October 1952. He wrote that he'd seen her again standing on the rocks where she'd fallen, watching the waves. He thought he was losing his mind. November 1952. She'd appeared in the keeper's house, standing by the window. He tried to speak to her, but she faded away. The entries continued. Years of them. He wrote about her growing older, or rather about seeing her at different ages. Sometimes 7, the age she died, sometimes 10, sometimes 13, sometimes 16. He wrote conversations they had, or that he imagined they had. She told him about things that hadn't happened yet, about storms that would come, about ships that would pass, about changes coming to the lighthouse. He started checking her predictions. They were accurate. By 1959, the entries had changed tone. He wasn't questioning whether she was real anymore. He accepted her presence, documented it clinically. She appeared every few weeks, stayed longer each time, seemed more solid. He wrote that she told him she was waiting. When he asked what for, she said she was waiting to stay. He wrote that he didn't understand what she meant, but he hoped she meant she'd come back to him somehow. The final entry in the journal was dated March 1962, just before he retired and moved away. It was short. Today I saw her again. This time, I think she'll stay. After that, nothing. No explanation, no follow-up, just that cryptic final sentence. I closed the journal and sat there feeling unsettled in a way I couldn't articulate. It was a sad story. A father's grief manifesting as hallucinations, nothing more. Except something about it felt wrong. I went home that evening and couldn't stop thinking about it. Over dinner, I mentioned it to my husband Nathan, told him about the tragic story I'd found. He listened, politely but seemed distracted, said it sounded like the man had probably had a mental breakdown from isolation. That made sense. That should have been the end of it. But I kept thinking about that final entry. This time, I think she'll stay. Stay how? Stay where? That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, and a thought occurred to me that was so ridiculous I almost laughed. But I couldn't let it go. I got up, went to my office, pulled out my birth certificate. I was born on March 15, 1962. The lighthouse keeper's final entry was dated March 14, 1962. One day before I was born. I told myself it was coincidence, meaningless. But the next morning I went back to the Historical Society and found the journal again, I reread every entry about his daughter. Her name was Georgie. My name is Georgina. My parents called me Georgie my whole childhood. I have dark hair. I grew up terrified of heights, but eventually loved watching the ocean. I collected shells as a child. These were common things, nothing specific, nothing that couldn't be coincidence. But then I found the photographs. They'd been in the same box as the journal, loose pictures that had been tucked between the pages. Most were of the lighthouse, the coastline, ships. But there were 3 photographs of a little girl, dark hair, serious expression, standing on the rocks by the lighthouse. I looked at those photographs for a long time. The girl looked like every photograph of me as a child. Same face shape, same eyes, same way of standing with one shoulder slightly higher than the other. I took the photographs home. I didn't tell Nathan what I was doing. I went through my parents' old photo albums, the ones they'd kept from my childhood. I found pictures of me at 7 years old. I put them next to the lighthouse photographs. The resemblance was impossible to deny. We could have been the same child. We looked like the same child. My parents are both dead now, have been for years. My mother passed in 2003, my father in 2009. I couldn't ask them about any of this, but I went through their papers, everything I'd kept after they died. I found my baby book, the kind mothers used to keep with records of first words and first steps. My mother's handwriting documented everything from my birth onward, except the handwriting in the first few pages was different, shakier, older. It looked like the handwriting in Thomas Whitmore's journal. I felt sick. I went back to the Historical Society and pulled every record I could find about Thomas Whitmore. He'd retired from the lighthouse in March 1962 and moved to Oceanside, bought a small house 3 blocks from where my parents lived. He died in 1963, a year after I was born, heart attack. But before he died, according to property records, he'd sold his house to a young couple who just moved to the area. Their names were listed. My parents' names. I sat there in the archives room trying to breathe normally. There had to be an explanation. Maybe Thomas had known my parents somehow. Maybe he'd been a family friend. Maybe that's why they bought his house. But we'd never lived in that house. I grew up in a different house on the other side of town. I checked the records. My parents bought the Oceanside house in March 1962, the same month I was born. They sold it 3 months later and moved. Why buy a house and sell it immediately? Unless they hadn't bought it to live in. Unless they'd bought it for something else. I started having dreams. Not nightmares exactly, but strange, displaced memories that felt like they belonged to someone else. Standing in a lighthouse tower watching the light rotate. The smell of lamp oil and salt air. A man's voice teaching me to read the clouds. The specific pattern of rocks below the lighthouse. The tidal pools. The way the water sounded when it rushed in. Places I'd never been. Memories I'd never made. Except when I drove out to Cape Mear's lighthouse the following weekend and looked down at the rocks. Everything was exactly how I remembered it. Nathan thinks I'm having some kind of episode. He wants me to see a doctor, suggests maybe early dementia. I went to keep him calm. The doctor ran tests. Everything came back normal. She said stress can cause false memories. That perhaps reading the journal had created a kind of suggestion that my mind was filling in with invented details. That made sense, medically. But it didn't explain the photographs. It didn't explain why I could describe the interior layout of the lighthouse keeper's quarters perfectly, even though I'd never been inside, and the building isn't open to the public. Last week, I went back to the lighthouse at dawn. I stood on the rocks where the journal said his daughter fell. I don't know what I expected to feel. Some kind of recognition maybe, some proof that I was connected to this place and this story. But I didn't feel anything except cold wind and the spray of waves. I stood there for an hour watching the ocean, trying to understand what it meant. Was I his daughter somehow? Had something impossible happened that brought her back, put her into my mother's womb, let her live the life she'd lost? Or was I just a woman in her 60s losing her grip on reality, seeing patterns in coincidences because the alternative was admitting there was nothing special about any of it? I still have the journal. I keep it in my desk drawer, and sometimes I read that final entry. This time, I think she'll stay. Did he see my mother pregnant? Did he somehow know? Or did something even stranger happen that morning? Something that put his daughter's soul, or consciousness, or whatever you want to call it, into a child about to be born 3 blocks away. I've been teaching history for 41 years. I believe in evidence, documentation, rational explanation. But I also believe that I remember things I shouldn't remember, that I've lived in places I've never been, that somewhere deep in whatever makes me who I am, there's a 7-year-old girl who fell from the rocks and a father who loved her so much he kept seeing her for 10 years until she could come back. Nathan wants me to throw the journal away. He says it's not healthy, that I'm obsessing over something that doesn't matter. But how do I throw away the only evidence that I might be living someone else's second chance? How do I pretend I don't know that I might exist because a grieving father refused to let go? Every morning I wake up and I'm Georgina, 63 years old, retired teacher living an ordinary life. But underneath that, I feel something else. Someone else. A girl who drowned and somehow found her way back. I don't know if that's beautiful or horrifying. I don't know if I'm her or if I'm just me, borrowing her memories like I borrowed her name. All I know is that I can't stop wondering what happened on March 15th, 1962, the day I was born, and the day Thomas Whitmore finally let his daughter stay. So tell me something. If you discovered your entire life might be someone else's answered prayer, would you want to know the truth? My name is Thalia, and I work as an environmental field technician for the State Wildlife Department. I'm 28, been doing this job for 3 years now, moved to Oregon from Arizona because I wanted something different from the desert heat. The high desert out here is nothing like Arizona though. It's colder, emptier, has this stark quality that gets under your skin. My job involves monitoring wildlife populations, setting up trail cameras, checking on endangered species habitats. Most of the time I'm alone out there for days at a stretch, which suits me fine. I've never been great with people anyway. Always preferred the company of animals in open spaces. This past summer, I was assigned to monitor sage grouse populations around Brothers, which is barely even a town. Maybe 300 people live out there, spread across miles of nothing. I rented a trailer on the outskirts and spent my days checking camera traps I'd set up along Highway 20 and the surrounding areas. Sage grouse are these quirky birds that do elaborate mating dances, and their numbers have been declining, so we track their movements and breeding patterns. It's tedious work, but I find it meditative. Just me, the cameras, the data, the birds. I had about 40 cameras positioned at various points, checking them every week, downloading footage, replacing batteries. Most of what I captured was exactly what you'd expect. Sage grouse, obviously. Pronghorn antelope passing through. Coyotes, jackrabbits, the occasional confused deer. You watch enough wildlife footage and you start to recognize patterns, the rhythms of how animals move through landscape. They're creatures of habit, following the same trails, appearing at roughly the same times. In early June, one of my cameras picked up a pronghorn crossing Highway 20 at milepost 47, right near this curve in the road where the sagebrush gets thick on both sides. Nothing unusual about that. Pronghorn cross roads all the time. This one was a buck, decent size, healthy looking. The timestamp said 9:47 p.m. I noted it in my log and moved on. The next week when I checked the camera, there he was again. Same spot, same time. 9:47 p.m. Same pronghorn, I was pretty sure, based on his markings and the way he moved. Still nothing too strange. Animals can be territorial, stick to familiar routes. But then it kept happening. Every single night. I started checking that camera more frequently, downloading footage every few days instead of weekly. The pronghorn crossed at 9:47 p.m. without fail. Exactly the same spot, exactly the same time, down to the minute. After 2 weeks of this, I started noticing something else. His gait was slightly off, a small hitch in his back left leg, like he was favoring it. I wondered if he'd injured himself somehow. Week 3, I was driving back to my trailer around 10 at night, and I passed milepost 47. I saw the pronghorn crossing in my headlights. I hit the brakes, watched him make it across that same limping gait. Then I heard the sound of another vehicle coming from the opposite direction, moving fast. I wanted to flash my lights, warn them, but it happened too quick. The truck hit the pronghorn square on. I heard the impact, saw the animal go down. The truck didn't even slow down, just kept going into the darkness. I pulled over, grabbed my flashlight, ran back to where the pronghorn had fallen. He was lying in the road, breathing hard, clearly hurt bad. I've seen enough injured animals to know when there's nothing you can do. His back was broken. I sat with him while he died, which took maybe 5 minutes. Then I dragged his body off the road into the sagebrush so other cars wouldn't hit him. I felt sick about it the rest of the night. The next evening, I checked my camera. 9:47 p.m. The pronghorn crossed. Same one. I could see the distinctive marking on his shoulder, the white patch shaped like a crescent. But that was impossible because I'd watched him die less than 24 hours earlier. I went back to where I'd dragged the body off the road. It was still there, already starting to smell in the heat, flies gathering. I took photographs of it, documented the markings. Then I went back to my trailer and reviewed the camera footage again. Same animal. Absolutely the same. I didn't sleep that night. I kept telling myself there had to be 2 pronghorn with similar markings, that I'd made a mistake in the dark. But I knew I hadn't. The next day, I moved another camera to point directly at the road, angle it so I'd capture not just the pronghorn crossing, but also any vehicles. That night at 9:47, he crossed again. 3 nights later, a sedan hit him. I wasn't there to see it, but the camera caught everything. The impact, the pronghorn going down, the car driving away. The timestamp was 9:51 p.m. The following morning, I drove out there, found the body, fresh this time, still warm, dragged it off the road to a different spot than the first one, marked the location on my GPS. That evening, 9:47 p.m., the pronghorn crossed again. Now there were 2 dead bodies in the sagebrush and 1 living animal that shouldn't exist. This continued for weeks. I documented every crossing, every death. He got hit 6 times total over the course of July. Twice by trucks, 3 times by cars, once by an RV that didn't even notice. Each time I'd find the body the next morning, and each evening he'd appear again on my camera, crossing at 9:47 p.m. The limp got worse. By the 4th death, he was barely able to move his back legs. By the 6th, he was dragging himself across the road, taking nearly 4 minutes to make a crossing that should have taken 30 seconds. I started sitting out there at night, parking my truck at milepost 47, watching. I needed to see this with my own eyes, not just through camera footage. The first night I did this, he appeared right on schedule, stepped out of the sagebrush on the south side of the highway, stood there for a moment in my headlights. I could see how badly damaged he was. Open wounds that hadn't healed, bones showing through torn hide, one eye clouded over. But he was alive, or something like alive. He looked directly at me. I've worked with wildlife long enough to recognize awareness in an animal's eyes. This wasn't just instinct. This was suffering. He knew he was hurt, and he was doing it anyway. He crossed the road dragging his useless back legs, making these awful sounds that pronghorn don't normally make. It took him 6 minutes. No cars came. He made it to the other side, disappeared into the sagebrush. I got out of my truck, followed his trail. Blood on the rocks, disturbed sand, the smell of infection. The trail went about 50 yards and then just stopped. No pronghorn, no body. Just ended like he'd vanished into air. I went back every night after that. Sometimes he'd make it across without getting hit. Sometimes cars would strike him, and he'd go down and lie there twitching until he died. It was never quick. I watched him die 4 more times in August. Each time was worse than the last because his body was accumulating damage, not healing. By the end of August, he wasn't really recognizable as a pronghorn anymore. Just this broken thing that kept trying to cross the road. I filed reports with my supervisor, sent her the footage. She called me in for a meeting, asked if I was feeling okay, suggested maybe I needed some time off. She said the footage clearly showed the same animal repeatedly, but that didn't mean it was the same individual, that pronghorn can look similar, that I was probably dealing with a small herd that used that crossing point. She didn't say I was crazy, but the implication was there. I stopped filing reports. September came and he was still crossing. The limp was so severe now that he could barely move. 90 consecutive nights of footage. 90 nights of watching this animal try to cross Highway 20 at exactly 9:47 p.m. I started having nightmares about it, dreaming I was the one crossing the road over and over, unable to stop, knowing I was going to get hit, but unable to change course. On September 30th, I was parked at milepost 47 like I'd been doing every night. 9:47 came and went. No pronghorn. I waited until midnight. Nothing. I checked my cameras the next morning. No footage. He hadn't crossed. I felt this strange mix of relief and loss, like something had finally ended, but I didn't know what it meant. I went out to the sagebrush where he always emerged from. I don't know what I was looking for exactly. Closure, maybe, or proof that I hadn't imagined the whole thing. I found him about 30 yards in. He was lying on his side, finally still, finally dead. But this death looked different from all the others. This one looked peaceful, if you can call any death peaceful. His eyes were closed, no visible trauma. He'd just stopped. I should have left him there, should have walked away and let nature take its course. But I needed to understand what had happened, needed some kind of scientific explanation for what I'd witnessed. I called a veterinarian I knew in Bend, asked if she'd be willing to do a necropsy if I brought her a pronghorn carcass. She agreed, probably thought it was weird, but didn't ask too many questions. I loaded the body into my truck and drove the 2 hours to Bend. The vet, her name was Skylar, she examined him for almost 3 hours. I waited in the lobby drinking bad coffee and trying not to think about what she'd find. When she finally came out, her face was pale. She asked me where I'd found this animal. I told her. She asked how recently it had died. I said maybe 6 hours. She looked at me like I was lying. She said based on decomposition and tissue damage, this animal had been dead for at least 3 months. She said the injuries were consistent with multiple vehicle strikes, that the skeletal structure was completely shattered in places, that half the organs were necrotic. She said there was no way this pronghorn had been alive even yesterday, let alone this morning. I showed her my phone, pulled up the footage from the night before, September 30th, 9:47 p.m., the pronghorn crossing. She watched it 3 times without saying anything. Then she deleted her examination notes and told me she couldn't help me, that I needed to dispose of the carcass myself, that she didn't want any record of this. I asked her what she thought was happening. She said she didn't know and didn't want to know, and I should probably stop trying to figure it out too. I drove back to Brothers with the body still in my truck bed. I didn't know what to do with it. I ended up taking it back to milepost 47 and leaving it where I'd found it. Let the scavengers have it. Let it return to the desert. I packed up my trailer the next day, requested a transfer to a different monitoring site. My supervisor approved it without questions. I've been working up near Crater Lake for the past 2 months. Different landscape, different animals, different patterns. But I still think about that pronghorn every single day. I think about why it kept crossing, what it was trying to reach on the other side of that highway. Whether it knew it was already dead or if some part of it was still trying to live. I think about those 91 nights of footage I have saved on my hard drive, documentary evidence of something that shouldn't be possible, Last week I got a call from another field tech who took over my old monitoring area. He asked if I'd experienced anything unusual around milepost 47. I asked him what he meant. He said his cameras had picked up something crossing the highway every night at 9:47 p.m., but it wasn't a pronghorn anymore. He couldn't quite tell what it was. The footage was distorted, the shape wrong. He asked if I had any advice. I told him to request a transfer and not to try to understand it. Then I hung up. Here's what I want to know. If something kept trying to complete a journey even after death made it impossible, would you try to help it finish, or would you walk away? My name is Eliza, and I'm a social worker for the state of Oregon. I'm 42, been doing this work for about 15 years now, mostly child protective services and foster care placements. It's hard work, the kind that grinds you down over time, but I've always felt like it mattered. I've seen a lot of things in this job that would break most people, kids in situations nobody should have to endure. But you develop a kind of professional distance that lets you keep functioning. You have to, or you'd never make it through a single week. What happened last spring, though, that broke through every defense I'd built up over the years. I got assigned a case in early March, a 12-year-old boy living with his grandmother in Enterprise, way up in the northeastern corner of Oregon near the Wallowa Mountains. The grandmother had called our office herself, said she was worried about her grandson, that he hadn't spoken a single word in over 4 months, and she didn't know what to do anymore. The boy's name was Dulcie, which is unusual for a boy, but his mother had been from Mexico, and apparently it was a family name. The mother had died 2 years prior, drug overdose, and the father was never in the picture. The grandmother was all he had left. I drove up there on a Thursday, took most of the day to make the trip from my office in La Grande. Enterprise is beautiful in that stark mountain way, but it's incredibly isolated. Population maybe 800 people, surrounded by wilderness. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where outsiders are noticed immediately. The grandmother's house was small but well kept, flowers in the yard despite the late snow still on the ground. She met me at the door, a woman in her 70s named Avery, tired eyes but a firm handshake. Dulcie was sitting at the kitchen table when I came in. Thin kid, dark hair, staring down at a piece of paper in front of him. He didn't look up when I entered, didn't acknowledge my presence at all. Avery made coffee and we talked in low voices while Dulcie sat there drawing. She told me it started right after his mother's funeral. He just stopped talking, completely nonverbal. She'd taken him to doctors in Boise, even driven him all the way to Portland to see specialists. Nobody could find anything physically wrong with him. Trauma response, they said. Selective mutism brought on by grief. They recommended therapy, medication, time. Nothing had helped. But the drawings were what really worried her. She showed me a stack of them, maybe 50 pages deep. Every single one was disturbing. Scenes of violence, of people suffering, detailed illustrations of historical events that a 12-year-old shouldn't know about. Battles, massacres, executions. The detail was incredible and deeply unsettling. Some of them had dates written in the corners, all from the 1800s. I asked if he was learning about this period in school. Avery said, no, that the school here didn't cover much beyond basic. Oregon Trail history, nothing this specific. I sat down across from Dulce and introduced myself, explained that I was there to help, asked if he could show me what he was working on. He didn't respond, just kept drawing. I watched his hand move across the paper. He was sketching a landscape, mountains in the background, a valley. Then he started adding figures, people on horseback, other people on foot running. The detail was remarkable for a kid his age. Then he started drawing bodies, lots of them. Avery left the room, said she couldn't watch anymore. I stayed at the table with Dulcie, watching him work. He drew for almost an hour without stopping, filling in tiny details, faces contorted in pain, specific clothing, weapons, terrain features. When he finally finished, he pushed the paper across the table to me. At the bottom, he'd written a date, June 1877. Then he started another drawing immediately, wouldn't make eye contact, wouldn't acknowledge that I was there. I took the drawing and looked at it more carefully. Something about it felt familiar, historically significant, but I couldn't place it. I asked Avery if I could take some of the drawings with me, said I wanted to consult with some colleagues about them. She agreed, seemed relieved that someone was taking this seriously. I gathered up about 20 of the drawings, told Dulcie I'd bring them back, promised I'd see him again soon. He never looked at me once. On the drive back to La Grande, I couldn't stop thinking about those drawings. The level of detail, the historical specificity, the way Dulce had rendered the suffering with such precision. When I got home that evening, I spread them out on my dining room table and started researching. The dates, the landscapes, the clothing styles. It took me 3 hours, but I finally figured out what I was looking at. The Nez Perce War. The forced removal of the Nez Perce tribe from their homeland in the Wallowa Valley. 1877. The drawings depicted specific events from that conflict. Battles, forced marches, the deaths of tribal members and soldiers. But they weren't just generic representations. They showed specific moments, specific places. I found historical accounts that matched details in the drawings. A particular rock formation in one sketch corresponded to a documented battle site. The clothing on certain figures matched photographs I found in archives. The positions of bodies matched written accounts from soldiers who'd been there. This was impossible. There was no way a 12-year-old kid in Enterprise could have access to this level of historical detail, much less the artistic skill to render it so accurately. But the most disturbing part was the perspective. The drawings weren't from an elevated viewpoint or an observer's position. They were from ground level, from within the events themselves, like someone had been there, witnessing it firsthand. I contacted a historian at the local community college, someone I'd worked with before on a different case involving tribal family placement. His name was Macy, young guy but very knowledgeable about regional history. I showed him photographs of Dulcie's drawings. He went very quiet, studied them for a long time. Finally, he asked where I'd gotten them. I explained the situation. He asked if he could meet Dulcie. We drove up to Enterprise together the following week. Avery was grateful for any help. Let us sit with Dulcie in the kitchen. Macy brought historical photographs with him, old images from the 1800s, some from the Nez Perce War period. He laid them out on the table without saying anything. Dulcie looked at them. Then he started drawing. He drew the same scenes from the photographs, but from different angles. He drew people who weren't visible in the photos, but who would have been there based on historical records. He drew a man in specific clothing, detailed his face with careful precision. Macy's hand started shaking. He pulled out his phone, searched for something, showed me a screen. It was a historical document, a military roster from 1877. One of the soldiers listed had a small notation about his appearance, unusual features. Macy pointed to Dulcie's drawing. The face he'd drawn matched the written description exactly, but there were no photographs of this soldier, no visual record of what he'd looked like. Just a written description buried in military archives that nobody except historians specializing in this specific conflict would ever read. Macy asked Avery if Dulce had any Nez Perce ancestry. She said no, that his mother's family was from southern Mexico. His father was supposedly white, but she'd never met him. No connection to this region's tribal history at all. Macy asked if he could take Dulce to some of the historical sites, places where events from the war had occurred. Avery hesitated, protective, but ultimately agreed. The next day, we drove Dulce out to several locations in the Wallowa Valley, places where battles had happened, where camps had been, where people had died. At each site, Dulce would get out of the car and just stand there, completely still, staring. Then he'd pull out his sketch pad and draw. He drew the landscape as it had been, before modern development. He drew the people who'd been there, their faces, their positions. At one site, he walked to a specific spot, knelt down, and started drawing what appeared to be a person lying on the ground. Macy checked his historical documents. A Nez Perce elder had died at almost that exact location during the forced removal. The death was documented, but the specific spot was never recorded, at least not in any surviving records. At the last site near Joseph, Dulcie did something different. He drew himself, not as he was now, but as a figure in period clothing, standing among the people being forced from their land. He was crying in the drawing, but his face was emotionless as he sketched it. When he finished, he looked up at Macy for the first time, just looked at him, this flat stare that went on too long. Then he went back to drawing. We returned to Avery's house in silence. I didn't know what to say. Macy was pale, kept running his hands through his hair, clearly shaken. Inside, Avery made tea and we sat around the kitchen table trying to make sense of what we'd witnessed. Dulcie sat in the living room, still drawing. Macy finally said what I'd been thinking but didn't want to voice. He said sometimes, in tribal traditions, there's a belief that trauma can be carried across generations, that witnesses to great suffering can be reborn, carrying those memories. He said he'd heard stories, mostly dismissed as folklore, about children who remembered things they shouldn't, who carried the weight of historical pain in ways that defied explanation. I asked him if he believed that. He said he didn't know what he believed anymore, but he knew what he'd seen. He said Dulcie was drawing things that weren't in any accessible records, details that only someone who'd been present could know. He said the boy wasn't just learning history, he was remembering it. And if that was true, if Dulcie was somehow carrying the memories of someone who'd witnessed the Nez Perce removal, then we were looking at a child bearing witness to genocide in a way that nobody should have to experience, let alone a 12-year-old who was already dealing with the trauma of losing his mother. Before we left, Macy asked if he could show Dulcie one more thing. He pulled out a photograph, very old, damaged, barely visible. It showed a group of Nez Perce people, no individual faces clear enough to identify. He placed it in front of Dulcie. The boy looked at it for a long time. Then he took his pencil, and on a fresh piece of paper, he drew one of the faces from the photograph, enlarged it, made it visible. An old man, weathered features, deep sadness in his eyes. At the bottom, Dulcie wrote a name in careful letters. Macy grabbed his phone again, searched frantically. The name matched a recorded tribal elder who'd been part of the forced removal, who died during the journey. There were no known photographs of him clear enough to show his face. Macy started crying, just sat there at the kitchen table with tears running down his face. He said the name Dulcie had written was his great-great-great-grandfather. He said his family had stories about this man, passed down through generations, but no images, no physical proof he'd even existed beyond written records. He said this boy had just drawn his ancestor's face, someone he'd never heard of, and gotten it right. I've been back to see Dulcie 4 times since then. He still doesn't speak. He's still drawing, filling page after page with scenes from 1877. Avery is managing, barely, trying to care for a child who's living in 2 times at once. I've arranged for specialized therapy, trauma counseling, everything I can think of. Nothing touches whatever he's experiencing. He just keeps drawing, keeps witnessing, keeps carrying something that happened almost 150 years ago, like it's happening right now in front of him. The last time I visited, I brought the drawing he'd made of Macy's ancestor. I wanted to give it to Dulcie, tell him it meant something to someone, that his witness mattered. But when I walked into the house, Dulcie was drawing again. This time he was drawing me, but not as I am now. He was drawing me standing in the Wallowa Valley in 1877, standing among the bodies, and in the drawing, I was crying. I've never told him where my grandmother was from, never mentioned that my family has distant Nez Perce connections that I only learned about as an adult. He couldn't have known that. But somehow he drew me there. Drew me as a witness, like he was showing me that I was connected to this too, that we all carry it somehow. If a child showed you proof of trauma that happened generations before they were born, would you believe they were remembering it? Or would you find another explanation? My name is Rosa, and I run an estate sale business here in McMinnville. Been doing it for about 12 years now. Started after my divorce, when I needed something to keep myself busy and make some money. It's not glamorous work, but it's steady, and honestly, I like it. You get to see how people lived their whole lives, what they valued enough to keep, what gets left behind when they're gone. I'm 57 now, pragmatic about death in a way most people aren't. You handle enough deceased people's belongings and it stops being morbid, just becomes part of the job. Last October, I got a call about a property on the west side of town. Older neighborhood, nice houses with big yards. The woman who'd lived there had passed away at 91. No immediate family, distant relatives handling the estate from out of state. They wanted everything cleared out and sold, standard arrangement. I drove over to assess the job, see what we were working with. The house was a craftsman style, well maintained, probably built in the 20s. Inside, it was like stepping back in time. Original fixtures, antique furniture, that particular smell old houses get when the same person has lived there for decades. I spent about 3 hours doing my initial walkthrough, taking notes, photographing items, estimating values, the usual mix of things. Some valuable antiques, a lot of everyday objects that had meaning to their owner but wouldn't fetch much at sale. I was in the bedroom, going through the closet, when I found a wooden box on the top shelf, pushed way back behind some hat boxes. It was heavy, ornately carved, locked. I brought it downstairs and used a screwdriver to pop the lock. Not supposed to force things open usually, but the relatives had said they wanted everything assessed, and I needed to know what was inside for inventory purposes. The box contained a family Bible, large, leather-bound, the kind families used to keep for generations to record births, marriages, deaths. I opened it carefully because these things can be fragile, and sometimes they're worth decent money to collectors. The family name written inside was Henderson. I flipped to the records pages in the front. Someone had meticulously filled in names and dates going back to the 1890s. Births, marriages, deaths, all in that careful old-fashioned handwriting that nobody does anymore. I was about to close it and move on when I noticed something strange. Some of the death dates were for people still living. I know that sounds impossible, but I checked the birth dates against the death dates, and several people listed should still be alive based on the years. Then I realized these weren't historical records. Some of the names were recent, people born in the 70s and 80s, and their death dates were filled in just like the older entries. Same handwriting style, but different ink, fresher. I pulled out my phone and started searching the names. The first one I looked up, a woman named Catherine Henderson, born 1981, death date listed as March 15, 2019. I found her obituary online. She died March 15, 2019. Car accident. The obituary matched the information in the Bible exactly, including survived by relatives whose names were also in the Bible. I checked another name, Michael Henderson, born 1975, death date listed as November 3, 2021. Found his obituary. Died November 3, 2021. Heart attack at 46. I went through 7 names. Every single one matched. The death dates in the Bible were accurate, written in before the people died, but completely correct. I felt cold sitting there in that dead woman's living room, holding this Bible with its impossible predictions. I flipped through more pages. There were maybe 30 names total with future death dates listed, people who, according to the Bible, hadn't died yet, but would. Most of the dates were years away, scattered through the 2020s and 2030s. Then I found my own name, Rosa Martinez, born 1967. Death date, January 8, 2025. That's 2 months from now. I dropped the Bible. just let it fall right onto the hardwood floor. My hands were shaking so badly I couldn't hold it. January 8th, 2025. 10 weeks away. I picked up the Bible again, checked the name, the birth year. It was definitely me. There's not a lot of Rosa Martinez's born in 1967 in this area. It had to be me. Someone had written my name in this Bible and marked me for death in 10 weeks. I should have put the Bible back in the box and walked away. Should have finished my job, conducted the estate sale, never thought about it again. But I couldn't. I took the Bible home with me that night. I know that's theft, technically, but I needed to understand what this was. I spent hours going through it, checking every name I could find online. The pattern held. Everyone with a death date that had already passed was actually dead, died on exactly the day listed. Everyone with a future date was still alive. It was a perfect record. I started researching the Henderson family, trying to figure out who'd owned this Bible, who'd been writing in it. The woman who'd just died, Margaret Henderson, had lived in that house since 1952. Never married, no children, worked as a librarian for 40 years. Quiet life, no obvious connection to anything supernatural or strange, but she'd maintained this Bible, added names to it, filled in death dates with mechanical precision for decades. I called one of the distant relatives handling the estate, asked about Margaret, if she'd had any unusual interests or hobbies. The relative, a nephew who barely knew her, said she'd always been eccentric, kept to herself, was obsessed with genealogy and family history. Nothing about predicting deaths, nothing that explained the Bible. Over the next week, I became obsessed with it. I'd wake up at 3 in the morning and pull out the Bible, stare at my name, that date, January 8th, 2025. I started checking the names of people with upcoming death dates, seeing if I could find them online, figure out who they were. Most were Henderson family members, scattered across Oregon and Washington. A few weren't Hendersons, seemed to have no connection to the family, like me. I have no Henderson relatives, no connection to that family at all, but someone had added my name to their death Bible. I thought about going to the police, but what would I say? I found a book that predicts deaths and mine is listed. They'd think I was crazy. I thought about destroying the Bible, burning it, like somehow that would change what it said. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. Some superstitious part of me thought destroying it might make things worse, might make the prediction come true faster. 3 weeks after I found the Bible, one of the names with a near-future death date died. Thomas Henderson, death date October 29, 2024. I'd been watching his social media, this morbid surveillance I couldn't stop. He seemed fine, healthy guy in his 50s. Posted about his grandkids and his woodworking hobby. October 29th came. That evening I checked his page obsessively. October 30th, his daughter posted that he'd passed away, suddenly the night before. Stroke. He'd been watching TV and just gone. October 29th, 2024. Exactly as the Bible had said. That's when I really started to panic. This wasn't coincidence or lucky guesses. This Bible knew. Somehow it knew when people would die, and it was never wrong. And it said I had until January 8th. I made an appointment with my doctor, got a full physical, blood work, everything. She said I was healthy for my age, blood pressure a little high but nothing concerning. No signs of heart disease, no cancer markers, nothing that would kill me in the next few weeks. I started being obsessively careful, driving slowly, checking smoke detectors, avoiding anything risky. I canceled a hiking trip I'd planned because what if I fell? I stopped using my space heater because what if there was a fire? I was trying to outsmart fate, trying to make it to January 9th through pure caution. My daughter Marilyn noticed I was acting strange, asked what was going on. I couldn't tell her. How do you tell your kid that you found a book that says you're going to die in a few weeks? December came. Another name from the Bible died on their predicted date, then another in early December. The accuracy was perfect, unbreakable. I lie awake at night doing the math. 43 days, 37 days, 29 days, counting down to January 8th like it was an appointment I couldn't miss. I drafted a will, updated my insurance beneficiaries, wrote letters to Marilyn and my ex-husband, practical preparations for the inevitable. Marilyn came over 2 weeks ago, said she was worried about me, that I seemed depressed. I broke down and told her everything, showed her the Bible, showed her my name, the date. She looked at it for a long time, then closed the book and took my hands. She said it was just a weird coincidence that someone had written random dates, and some of them happened to be right. She said I was letting anxiety convince me of something impossible. She said January 8th would come and go and I'd be fine. I wanted to believe her, but then I showed her the record. Every single death date that had passed was correct. Every single one. The odds of that being coincidence were astronomical. She got quiet. She took the Bible home with her, said she was going to figure this out, research the Henderson family, find some rational explanation. She called me the next day. She'd found Margaret Henderson's journals in some boxes from the estate sale, documents I hadn't gotten to yet. Margaret had written about the Bible. She'd inherited it from her grandmother, who'd inherited it from her grandmother before that. The Bible had been in the Henderson family since the 1890s, and it had always known. Margaret's journals described how it worked. Once every few years, names would appear in the Bible on their own, written in handwriting that matched the original entries, but appearing overnight when no one was writing. Margaret would check the Bible every morning, and sometimes there would be new names, new dates. She'd tried to warn people once, back in the 60s. Tried to tell a Henderson cousin that his death date was coming. He'd laughed at her, called her crazy. He died on the predicted date anyway. After that, she stopped warning people, just maintained the record, watched the dates come true, accepted it as something beyond her understanding or control. The last entry in Margaret's journal was dated a week before she died. She wrote that her own name had appeared in the Bible 6 months earlier with a death date. She'd known she was dying, had time to prepare. She wrote that she was grateful for the warning, that it let her make peace with her life. She wrote that she hoped whoever inherited the Bible would understand it wasn't evil, just true. Some things are just true, and you can't fight them. I'm writing this on January 3rd, 5 days left. I don't feel sick. Nothing hurts. I'm not in any danger that I can identify, but I believe the Bible now. I've watched too many names come true. I've seen the pattern hold too many times. January 8th is coming, and something is going to happen, and I won't see January 9th. Marilyn is staying with me, refuses to leave me alone. She thinks she can prevent it somehow, keep me safe through sheer vigilance. But Margaret's journals made it clear. You can't prevent it. The Bible doesn't cause deaths, it just knows. Somehow it knows, and it's never wrong. I've been thinking about what to do with the Bible after I'm gone. Should I destroy it so no one else has to see their death date written in permanent ink? Or should I pass it on, let it continue its record, give people the warning that Margaret talked about? I honestly don't know. There's something terrible about knowing, but also something almost merciful about having time to prepare, to say the things you need to say to make peace. So here's what I'm asking you. If you could know the exact date you were going to die, would you want to know? My name is Khaleesi, and I know that's an unusual name, but my parents were really into that show back when I was born, 29 years ago. I work as a photographer, mostly landscape and nature stuff, freelance work that lets me travel and set my own schedule. About 18 months ago, I moved to Mitchell, Oregon, which is barely even a town. Maybe 150 people live there, middle of nowhere in the high desert. I came here specifically for the Painted Hills, these incredible geological formations that change color depending on the light and time of year. I'd been planning a long-term art project, photographing the same locations daily to document the subtle shifts in appearance. The kind of obsessive documentation project that probably only makes sense to other artists. I rented a small house on the edge of town, Cheap because nobody wants to live out here unless they're running from something or looking for silence. I was looking for silence. The Painted Hills are about 10 miles outside Mitchell, part of the John Day fossil beds. I'd go out there every single day, same time, same spots, different light. I had maybe 15 locations marked with GPS coordinates that I'd photograph from identical positions each visit. The goal was to eventually create a time-lapse series showing an entire year of changes, maybe turn it into a gallery show or a book. I started the project in March of last year. Every morning, I'd drive out, set up my tripod, take my shots, come home and upload everything to my computer. Thousands of photos accumulating, organized by date and location. It was meditative work, repetitive in a way that quieted my mind. I'd had a bad breakup before moving here, needed to reset my head, and the routine helped. About 3 weeks into the project, I was reviewing photos from the previous day and noticed something in one of the shots. A figure in the far distance, maybe a quarter mile away, standing on one of the ridges. Just a dark shape against the colored clay. I figured it was another tourist, someone else out there taking pictures. The Painted Hills get visitors, not many, but enough that seeing another person isn't strange. I made a note of it and moved on. The next day, I took the same shots. When I reviewed them that evening, the figure was there again. Same location, same position. I zoomed in on my computer, but the distance was too great to make out details. Just a dark human-shaped form. I thought maybe it was the same person, someone else doing a photography project, or a hiker who liked that particular spot. Didn't think much of it, but then I went back through my archive, looking at previous days. The figure appeared in shots going back to my very first day. Same position, same spot. I'd been photographing the Painted Hills daily for 3 weeks, and this figure had been there every single time, always in the exact same location. I just hadn't noticed because I'd been focused on the foreground, the colors, and textures of the hills themselves. The figure was far enough away that it didn't draw attention unless you were specifically looking for it. I started checking more carefully. Every day for the next week, I'd take my shots and immediately review them on my camera's screen, zooming in on that ridge. The figure was always there. Never moved, never changed position. Just standing there, watching. After a week of this, I decided to hike out to that ridge and see what was there. Maybe it was a rock formation I'd been misinterpreting as a person, some trick of light and shadow. The hike took about 40 minutes through rough terrain. When I got to the spot where the figure should have been, there was nothing. Just empty ridge, clay, and rocks. No person, no unusual formation that could be mistaken for a human shape. I stood exactly where the figure appeared in my photos and took a shot back toward my usual photography position. Then I hiked back, went home, checked the photo I'd just taken. From that ridge, looking back, you could see my tripod set up clearly. And in the distance behind my tripod, on a different ridge, there was the figure. It had moved. Or I had moved, and it stayed in the same relative position to where I was photographing from. That's when I started feeling genuinely unsettled. I went back through my entire archive, every photo I'd taken since March. The figure appeared in every single shot where the Painted Hills were visible. Always in the background, always distant, always in a position where it would be visible from my camera angle. In some shots, it was barely a speck. In others, more clearly defined, but it was always there. I'd been photographing the same landscape daily for months, and this figure had been in every frame, and I'd never noticed until 3 weeks in. I'm not someone who believes in supernatural stuff. I look for rational explanations, but I couldn't rationalize this. No person stands in the exact same spot for months. No rock formation moves between shots. I started varying my schedule, going out at different times of day. Dawn, noon, sunset. The figure appeared in every photo, regardless of time. I tried different locations within the Painted Hills area, places miles apart. The figure appeared in all of them. always in the background, always positioned where it would be visible. I became obsessed with it. I'd spend hours examining each photo, zooming in as far as the resolution would allow, trying to make out details. The figure was always too far away for facial features, but I could tell it was humanoid. Dark clothing, standing upright. Sometimes I thought I could make out an arm raised, like it was waving or pointing. Other times it looked like it was just standing still. The quality degraded when I zoomed in too far, pixels breaking apart into meaningless blocks of color. I started documenting the figure specifically, creating a separate folder of cropped and enhanced images. I tracked its position relative to my camera angle, tried to map out where it would actually be standing. The geometry didn't make sense. Based on the perspective and distance markers in the landscape, the figure should have been in locations that were miles apart, sometimes in areas I knew were inaccessible by foot. Deep ravines, cliff faces, places you couldn't physically stand. Summer came. I'd been doing this project for 4 months. The figure was in every single photo. I stopped showing my work to anyone because I didn't want to explain it. How do you explain that you've been photographing the same landscape for months, and there's something in every shot that shouldn't be there? I thought about stopping the project entirely, but I couldn't. I needed to understand what this was. I started varying my approach. I set up multiple cameras at different angles simultaneously, trying to triangulate the figure's actual position. The results made no sense. Each camera showed the figure in a different location, always in the background of that specific camera's frame. It was like the figure existed in relation to the act of photographing, rather than in a fixed physical location. One morning in July, I got to my usual spot before sunrise, set up in the dark, waited for first light. As the sun came up and I started shooting, I saw movement in my peripheral vision. On the ridge, where the figure usually appeared, something was there. Actually, physically there. I could see it with my naked eye for the first time, not just through my camera. My heart started pounding. I kept shooting, rapid fire, capturing frame after frame while watching this thing on the ridge. It was definitely a human shape, dark silhouette against the dawn sky, and it was moving, not walking or gesturing, but changing, getting clearer, more defined, like something coming into focus. I shot an entire memory card, maybe 200 photos, watching this thing become more solid. Then the sun broke fully over the horizon, and the figure was gone, vanished in the direct light. I checked my camera immediately. The last 50 photos showed the figure in perfect clarity. Not a distant speck anymore, close enough to see details, and what I saw made my stomach drop. It was me. The figure was me. Same height, same build, same way of standing with my weight on one leg. In the photos where I could see its face, it was my face. I was photographing myself standing on that ridge, watching myself take photographs. I packed up my gear and left, drove straight home, hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the steering wheel. I uploaded those photos and went through them frame by frame. The figure started distant like always, then got progressively closer in each shot. By the final images, it was close enough that I could see I was wearing the same clothes I had on that morning. Same jacket, same boots. The figure was me, not from some other time, but me right then, existing in two places simultaneously. I didn't go back to the painted hills for a week. I stayed home, tried to process what I'd seen, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. I went through my entire archive again, thousands of photos. The figure had been getting incrementally closer in each one. I'd never noticed because the change was so gradual, a few pixels per day. But when I compared the first photo to the most recent, the progression was obvious. The figure had been approaching my position steadily since March, and now it was close enough that I could see it was me. I forced myself to go back. I had to know what this meant. I drove out to the Painted Hills on a Tuesday morning, set up at my usual spot, took my shots, reviewed them immediately. The figure was there, closer than before. Close enough now that if it were really a person standing out there, I should be able to see it without a camera. But when I looked at the ridge with my eyes, nothing. Only through the camera lens did it exist. I kept going back, every day documenting this impossible thing. The figure got closer in each set of photos. By August, it was close enough that I could see my own expression. I looked terrified in these images. The version of me on the ridge looked absolutely terrified, frozen in place, but clearly panicked. I wasn't feeling terrified when I took these shots, just confused and scared in a manageable way. But the figure looked like it was experiencing pure horror. September came. The figure was less than 100 yards away in my photos now. I could see details I didn't want to see. Scratches on the face version of me, clothes torn, dirt and what might have been blood. The ridge version looked like it had been through something terrible. I looked healthy, fine, standing at my tripod taking pictures, but the version in the photos looked destroyed. Last month, the figure was 50 feet away. I could see my own eyes in the photographs, wide and desperate. The mouth open like screaming, but no sound. Hands reaching forward, not waving, reaching. Like drowning, like trying to grab something. I stopped going every day, started going every few days, then once a week. But the progression continued based on calendar days, not on when I actually photographed. Each day that passed, the figure was closer in the next set of photos I took. 2 weeks ago, I went back. The figure was right behind my tripod position. In the photos, I could see myself standing there, taking pictures with this other version of me directly behind, reaching for my shoulder. Close enough to touch. I could see every detail, every scratch, every tear in the clothing, the absolute terror in the eyes. And I realized the clothes weren't just similar to mine. They were my clothes, but older, worn, like they'd been through months of exposure. I haven't gone back since then, but I know what's going to happen. The figure has been approaching since I started this project. It's been getting closer every single day, and it's me, some version of me that exists in that space, between the landscape and the photograph. I think about Margaret Henderson's Bible, about knowing when something's coming and being unable to stop it. This feels similar. I've been documenting my own approach toward myself, watching myself get closer for months. I deleted every photo yesterday. All of them. Thousands of images, 8 months of work, gone. I threw my camera in a drawer and haven't touched it since. But I know it doesn't matter. The figure isn't in the photos because I took them. The photos just showed me what's been there all along, and whatever's been approaching me since March is still approaching. It doesn't need my camera to exist. The camera just let me see it coming. If you'd been documenting something for months and realized you were photographing yourself getting closer, would you have stopped sooner or kept shooting to see what happened when you finally arrived? My name is Martha, and I've lived in Carlton most of my life. I'm 26 now, moved here when I was 7 after my parents bought a small vineyard on the edge of town. Carlton's tiny, maybe 2,000 people, tucked into the wine country hills south of Portland. Everyone knows everyone, which can be suffocating but also comforting depending on your perspective. I work at one of the local wineries doing hospitality and events. Decent job, lets me stay in the area. I never had big dreams of leaving. Never felt that restless thing some people feel about small towns. This place always felt like home. About 8 months ago, I got invited to join the Carlton Grange Hall. For anyone who doesn't know, Grange Halls are these old agricultural community organizations, sort of like a fraternal lodge for farming communities. They've been around since the 1800s, mostly focused on supporting local agriculture and community organizing. The Carlton Grange has been operating since 1891. Same building, same traditions. My parents were never members, but my boss Angel at the winery was, and she suggested I join. Said it would be good for networking, meeting more locals, getting involved in community events. I was actually excited about it. The Grange puts on the Harvest Festival every year, organizes the farmers market, does charity work. It felt like a way to put down deeper roots, become more integrated into Carleton beyond just working here. Angel sponsored my membership, and I went through the application process. It was surprisingly formal, references required, a review period, then a vote by existing members. When I got accepted in February, I felt genuinely honored, like I'd been recognized as a real part of the community. My first meeting was on a Tuesday evening in March. The Grange Hall is this beautiful old building on the main street. Wooden structure with high ceilings and original fixtures from over a century ago. About 40 people were there, ranging from folks in their 20s to people in their 80s. Very multi-generational, which I liked. The meeting started normally. Roll call, reading of minutes from the last meeting, treasurer's report, Robert's Rules of Order, everything very proper and procedural. We discussed upcoming events, voted on budget allocations for the farmers market, talked about building maintenance needs. Then the president, a woman named Dallas, who runs one of the bigger vineyards in the area, said we were moving to old business. She said it in this specific tone, slightly more serious, and the whole room changed. People sat up straighter, conversations stopped completely. Dallas opened this ancient ledger book, the kind with marbled covers and yellowed pages, and started reading from it. She said according to tradition and the needs of the community, it was time to determine which household would take the weight this year. I didn't understand what that meant. I looked at Angel sitting next to me, but she was focused on Dallas, face neutral. Dallas explained that the Grange had maintained a tradition since its founding in 1891, a practice that ensured the prosperity and stability of Carleton's agricultural community. Every year, one member household was selected to bear the weight so that others could flourish. She said it very matter-of-factly, like she was reading a weather report. Then people started nominating households, raising hands, stating names, giving brief justifications. The Hendersons had a good year. Maybe they could handle the weight. The Kowalskis just expanded their operation. Perhaps they had capacity. The Tanners were older. Might be their turn. People discussed this calmly, rationally, like they were deciding who should host the next potluck. Dallas recorded each nomination in the ledger, asked for seconds, followed parliamentary procedure exactly. I still wasn't understanding. I leaned over and whispered to Angel, asked what taking the weight meant. She whispered back that I should just listen, that it would become clear. The discussion continued. Someone pointed out that the Hendersons had taken the weight in 2007, so perhaps they shouldn't be considered yet. Someone else noted that the Kowalskis had young children, which might complicate things. The Tanners, it was mentioned, had already been approached informally and had indicated willingness. Then Dallas asked for clarification on what form the weight would take this year. People started suggesting options. Fire damage to barn structures. The loss wouldn't exceed insurance coverage but would be significant enough. Serious illness requiring hospitalization, nothing terminal but enough to create hardship. Accidental death of a household member, perhaps the elderly father who was already in poor health. Equipment failure leading to crop loss. Each suggestion was discussed for feasibility and impact. I felt my stomach turn cold. They were planning tragedies. Sitting in this community hall under fluorescent lights, discussing which family should experience death or disaster, like they were allocating funds for park maintenance. I must have made a sound because Angel put her hand on my arm, squeezed it in warning. I looked around the room. Everyone was participating calmly. These were people I knew, people I'd served wine to, people I saw at the grocery store. They were deciding methodically who would suffer this year. Dallas called for a vote. 3 households were on the ballot. The vote was conducted by secret ballot, little slips of paper passed around. Angel handed me one. I just held it, couldn't write anything. She whispered that I needed to vote, that abstaining would be noticed. I wrote the first name I saw, my hand shaking. The ballots were collected and counted. Dallas announced the results. The Tanners would take the weight this year, form to be determined based on circumstances. She made a notation in the ledger and thanked everyone for their thoughtful participation. The meeting moved on to new business. Someone proposed a bake sale for the school fundraiser. We voted on it. Approved. Someone else suggested